sermon, which will be recorded. I want to talk today about lessons from the pandemic and the spirals in our spiritual life. Now, I'm speaking to you today on a day on the East Coast in the mountains of West Virginia. You might hear some noise in the background. But it's really one of those perfect days. It's sunny, blue skies, and what's really amazing where I am is the cicadas are on their 17-year cycle. I don't know where you live, but I'm sure you've heard these too. And it's so loud out here, it sounds like a car alarm going off. They're so noisy. Every 17 years, the cicadas come out of the ground, they mate, and that's the noise that we hear. And with the noises, they're calling their partners. And then they mate, then they leave eggs, then the eggs fall to the ground and release, and the cicadas go into the ground for 17 years before they'll come out and do their mating dance again. So it's a beautiful example in nature where we see the cycles of life around us. Yesterday when I was hiking, I watched two hawks floating for hours, and it was interesting. They just went round and round and round in spirals as they looked for their next meal. It was really beautiful. And we can see these spirals, these cycles in nature. And we can also, as we learn more in science, we learn that our bodies, our makeup is made up of DNA, which is a helix, which is a type of spiral. And so spirals in the physical world, both in nature and within ourselves, are the building blocks of life. So I want to pay attention to spirals as I talk about this moment when we're coming through a cycle, ending of the pandemic, we all hope. And I've been reading a little bit about the Spanish flu 100 years ago in the United States and the epidemic, the death that ensued from it, and it was really devastating. There was very poor treatment. There were no vaccines. Many people died. And I was wondering, that cycle repeated itself a century later, but I really never heard much about it. I've certainly heard about World War II. I've heard about World War I. I've heard about various wars or things. I never really heard much about it. I was curious, and as I looked into it, the more I looked into it, it appeared that the people were so traumatized by the epidemic of that time that they wanted to put it behind themselves, and they threw themselves into what became the Roaring Twenties. And I thought, will we do the same thing? Will we be working very hard to put the pandemic behind us and just forget about it? Will we just sort of look at it as something we want to get beyond? So over the last few months, I've been paying close attention to how people are thinking about the pandemic and what it means to them. And the responses have been really fascinating. And I'm curious to hear your response in the discussion we have tonight. But maybe one of the more fascinating ones that was quite telling was from a woman who wanted to start personal coaching. And she basically said the pandemic had laid bare for her that she was just her job and her title. And if you take away that office that she was in, and you take away that title, and you take away business trips, well, she was forced by the pandemic to reflect. And it was an amazing and frightening experience. And she realized that she was way off path of her idealistic vision for her career. She was now consumed by status and income and how she compared to others. And her time alone in her apartment forced her to reflect. She described herself to me as the proverbial frog in the hot water. You know the story where if you put a frog in hot water, it will jump right out. But if you slowly turn the heat up, it's stuck. Well, that's how she felt. She got stuck into the hot water. She started her career as an idealist and wanting to do good, but as the heat got turned up, she got stuck in the water. And her salary got turned up, and her status in the community got turned up, and her mortgage and her car payments and her dinners out got turned up. And she found herself stuck. And then the summer, with the death of a loved one, she was really ready to focus on finding out who she was, what her higher goals was, and realized that she had to look at the pandemic as a wake-up call. But in the last weeks, and this has happened with a couple people, she told me that she no longer had time to work together. Her office opened up, her work was calling her, trips were being planned, profits needed to be made, her status at the firm was renewed. She wanted to stay essentially in the hot water. And she said, this is not the time to focus on my inner life, but I'd like to do that sometime in the future. And she concluded with me, the pandemic was a long nightmare. I asked myself, did it really happen? I just want to forget it and get back to normal. But I'll call you soon to start. So the thought of proactively using a crisis in our lives and imagining the new life that we could create can be very overwhelming. And it's a very common tendency that we want to fall back into what's comfortable, what we know. People who say, I want to get back to normal. Now that was one experience that was maybe the most fascinating for me, so I asked permission to share about it. But others had different experiences. One good friend confided in me that the pandemic was the best year of his life. And the reason was very interesting. He said that his biggest fear in life was that he would die alone. This is a relatively young person, younger than me. And that had consumed him his whole life, that fear. And the pandemic forced him to look deeper and face death and face his own truths. And he realized, I'm not afraid of dying anymore. And I'm not afraid of dying alone if that's what's going to happen. I don't really care. But for whatever reasons, for those reasons, he said, I'll be forever grateful for this pandemic that made me stop and focus and face my fears. And he said at one point when it was getting really bad for him, he said, I was spiraling. I thought it was an interesting choice of words, into depression, and then broke out of that spiral. And I find this idea of cycles in nature and spirals particularly helpful for us to understand the moment that we're in right now at the end of a pandemic. For at least our part of the world, and we hope it everywhere else. We see in India it's actually on the uptake again. But hopefully globally we're at the end of the pandemic. And it made me think of Mark Twain's quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And so this idea of history repeating itself, of cycles repeating themselves, are really interesting when we look at Swedenborg's insight into how we grow spiritually. And Swedenborg describes our spiritual growth as we're moving up or down a spiral. It's not linear. We're going either up or we're going down a spiral. And for those of you who've been to Church of the Holy City in Washington, D.C., the architect was a Swedenborgian who was the dean of Harvard School of Architecture. And to get to the second floor, you must walk up a spiral staircase that is an architectural awl, because it's cement and stone with nothing supporting it against the wall. It just sort of floats there in space. It's gorgeous. I can't help but think, though I can't prove it, that they were using that piece of architecture in that church to represent our spiritual life, that we're moving up or moving down the spiral as we do it. In our spiritual life, we're invited every day to take a step up, and we're also have the opportunity to take a step down. And we're also invited, if we so choose, to simply sit where we are. What I really love about this image of a spiral of our spiritual growth in life is that it makes the case that at different times in our life, we'll be at a different level of the spiral, and we'll be looking out and we'll be seeing things that are very similar to an earlier time in our life. So we might have seen the same look from the spiral at 8, 18, or 38, but it's different because of where we are. Hopefully we've moved up the spiral and we have a different perspective on it. I think that's a fascinating way to think about our growth in life. And wherever we are on the spiral looking out, we're seeing things for the first time. Swedenborg says our earthly mind prefers the downward steps, and our spiritual mind is always pushing us to take a step forward. What does that look like? Well, there are times in our lives where we fall victim to hatred of others. We're jealous, we're fearful, we want to manipulate, dominate. All that is a step downward. And then there's moments in our life where we use, for example, a crisis like the horrible pandemic or any other time in our life where we've struggled to gain greater self-awareness, to make better decisions, and to act, and then to, in our own lives, love others. And so our spiritual life, like a spiral staircase, can feel very slow and it can feel mundane. If you have a dear friend, if you have a partner, a spouse in your life, somebody you can confide in, very often what you share is just the mundane things: what I ate, what I did, where I walked, what I bought. Those just mundane things make up life. And it's true in our spiritual life too. Most of our life is just one step up, one small step, one action of love, one action of forgiveness, one action of letting go. And at times, like when we walk up a staircase, it doesn't feel like we're really going anywhere. Because spiral staircases can feel very slow. It's not that direct way up. But that's really our spiritual life. It's one day at a time, one step at a time. And like in the reading with Jacob, we're moving up, essentially a heavenly ladder. So the pandemic turns out to have been a catalyst for many of us to advance up or down. And it feels in my life that when you start in one direction or the other, you can get momentum. If you really start moving up a staircase, you can sort of get going. It's harder if you stop and start and stop and start. But the truth is, going down can be much easier, right? There's a certain ease to walking down the steps. It feels like gravity's with us. Now, ultimately, as we move up that spiral staircase of our spiritual life on earth, we transition out of an earthly staircase into a heavenly staircase, as in Jacob's ladder. And that's actually what we just celebrated Friday with Helen. She moved out of an earthly spiral staircase where she was growing to her last days. She was growing spiritually, making decisions to grow spiritually, one of which was her decision to be very open about her cancer with the church. For her, she said, I learned so much when the pastor in the 80s, Dick Baxter, taught me. Maybe my death can teach others. So there's an example of someone looking in a crisis and saying, let me take a step up. Let me see what I can do for others. And so that's why in our tradition, we don't have an image of God on a throne condemning people to hell. We simply have people, as they exit this life, continue on the spiral that they have chosen. That can be up, that can be down. The choice is ours. And there will be times in our life when we'll take 2 steps up and 1 step back, very often. But it's important that we keep seeking to move up the spiral. And that requires us to change our thoughts and to change our actions. I reflect as minister of Church of the Holy City on this last year of this pandemic, and I think a lot of beautiful things happened in the midst of this horrible crisis. In no way does it minimize people who lost jobs, who lost lives. It doesn't minimize that people died alone. Those are all true. And at the same time, there was some amazing spiritual things that happened. For me, as pastor of the church, I had a funny experience on Friday. I met Ross Capon, our church member here today, and it was strange to acknowledge we had never met in person. But through technology and the force of a pandemic moving us online, I felt like I knew him. I felt like he knew me. I think about Sherry Smith, who's here today from the Northwest this week, who joined our board. We've never met in person. But what a great addition she has been to our leadership team at the church. Personally, having my dad and my sister being part of worship is something I really treasure and I will always treasure. But, before this horrible pandemic, I couldn't get the act together to move to online services. I was forced to do it by a crisis, and there were steps forward. And I'm grateful to Katerina and Annabelle, particularly in those early weeks where the two of them would actually call up members and walk them through the process of getting online and joining. And then people like, of course, our officers, Tony and Malcolm, jumping into leadership. So, yeah, you could look at it as such a, it was a crisis, but I think for the church, there's so many good things that we grew. So I'm very grateful for all the voices, for all of you from around the country, because you've invigorated Church of the Holy City. And I'm really grateful to you all for taking a step forward with us as a community. It's meant a lot to all of us. Even in the life of the church building itself, which has been largely not used for worship, we use this time to figure out how we could prepare for when things are lifted. And that's starting to happen. And in fact, a book came out, Healing Our Divides, that's little essays in there for ministers, mainly of where you can heal divides and how you can bring things together. And we have a chapter that I wrote about our work as a spiritual entrepreneur hub, bringing the inner and the outer life together as an example of what churches can do. And it features the leadership of our most recent member, Shalonda Ingram. So we can take steps forward on our spiral staircase as a community and as individuals in the midst of what appears to be doom, gloom, and a crisis. Our life can move along. There will be moments when we are woken from a lull in our life and we'll see things clearly, and that's often a crisis. And crisis is our opportunity to grow. The choice is ours. We can step up or we can step down. The good news is God is always pulling us toward heaven. We can all take some time to reflect what we learned this pandemic year and use it to shift our thoughts to heavenly thoughts and use what we've learned to take a step up. Amen.